This is Jed Distler, and welcome to the Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Before we begin, I'd like to thank those who have been supporting this podcast from the beginning, and those who've made it possible for the Piano Maven to thrive. We're going to begin our second season on the first day of the year, on January 1st, 2025, by launching a special daily or almost daily mini-series. I'm not quite sure how often we'll run it, but there will be frequent episodes. And on this mini-series, I'm going to be recommending recordings of Beethoven's 32 piano sonatas, and each day I will recommend 2 recordings for each sonata without repeating a pianist. So that means 32 sonatas and 64 pianists. And I have some good news. We are now monetizing this podcast and accepting subscriptions through my Piano Maven Substack page in order to cover production expenses, which are crucial to keep the Piano Maven alive and thriving as we launch our second season. A paid subscription to my Substack page enables us to chat about things related to the piano and piano recordings, about piano topics, and about, well, really everything about the piano. And you also will receive invitations to participate in live Zoom chats where we will share listening experiences and host special guests. So please consider a paid subscription to my Piano Maven Substack by visiting the link provided in the episode description, which is https://2/ that go to the right, and that's Jed Distler Music. That's all one word, jeddistlermusic.substack.com. You will be glad that you subscribed, I can assure you. Of course, you can subscribe for free, and you still get to hear all of the podcast episodes on all major podcasting platforms. But I will be directing all commentary and feedback to my Substack page from YouTube. I tend to get most comments via YouTube. Anyway, let's move on, because this is our last podcast for 2024 and our last one in the first season. And I thought it would be appropriate to talk about 2024's memorable piano releases and reissues. It's certainly not going to be a comprehensive survey, but I thought I would talk about some releases that really impressed me this year. One of the first releases of 2024 that I reviewed was a disc by Behzad Abdurrahimov called Shadows of My Ancestors, and it contains one of the best recordings I've ever heard of Prokofiev's 10 pieces from the ballet Romeo and Juliet in the composer's own piano arrangement. And there's also a wonderful and really evocative cycle of piano pieces by the composer Dilarom Saidaminova that's called The Walls of Ancient Bukhara, that was written in 1973. And also on this disc, Behzad Abdurrahimov plays Maurice Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit. It's a really first-rate interpretation, and I think that his headlong and really quite diabolical way with the final movement Scarbo rivals Ivo Pogorelich, and that is a strong statement from me. Also from 2024, there was a 2-disc set on the Deutsche Grammophon label featuring Danil Trifonov and his one-time teacher and mentor Sergei Babayan playing the 2 Rachmaninoff suites for 2 pianos. Who transcribed this? Danil Trifonov transcribed the Adagio from Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony in a beautiful arrangement that they play. And also Trifonov and Babayan play the symphonic dances of Rachmaninoff in the composer's 2-piano arrangement. It's a marvelous disc. I mean, some of the tempos are hair-raisingly fast, but the control and finesse and sheer elegance of the playing is really quite wonderful. There also were 2 box sets by Australian eloquents called the Piano Library, and each of these sets consisted of various piano releases that, for the most part, had not gained official release before on compact disc. One of the box sets contains recordings originally issued on the Westminster and American Decca labels. And this is a set that contains recordings of Jorg Damus, Edith Farnadi, Clara Haskell, Nina Milkina, Raymond Lewenthal, Benno Moiseievich, Egon Petri, and Carlo Zecchi. And that's really worth checking out. But it was the other box set, the other piano library set, containing recordings issued by Deutsche Grammophon that I actually found more interesting, mainly in terms of the repertoire. And it contains pretty much the entire series of releases that Deutsche Grammophon brought out in the late 1970s, early 1980s, in a mid-price series called Concours, which mostly featured live performances by young competition winners, many of whom would go on to successful careers, such as Boris Bloch, Mikhail Feiermann, Stefan de Groot, Diana Kosko, Eva Pobloska, Alexandra Lonkwich, David Lively, and Georges Louis Prat. And it's good to have this whole wonderful series available again. There also were some live recordings from the Warsaw Chopin competition with Vladimir Ashkenazy and Michel Bloch that are included in this set. Also in the set is a previously unpublished recording of Debussy's Preludes Book 1 with Dino Ciani. It's not to be confused with a slightly later recording that he made that was published by Deutsche Grammophon. Also, there's a recording of the second piano sonata by Pierre Boulez with the pianist Claude Heffler. I didn't even know about this recording. It came out in the early 1970s. It would be superseded by the Maurizio Pollini recording from the late 1970s, but it's still good to have this. And also in this set is a 1963 Schumann recital by Veronika Joachim, and there are 2 CDs worth of Chopin by the Hungarian-Polish pianist Julian von Karoli. Also here are the 2 Beethoven sonata albums by Elie Nye from the 1950s. And here, the Appassionata Sonata's last movement repeat is restored. It was actually left out of an earlier CD release because they wanted to get the contents of these 2 LPs onto one CD, so they got rid of that repeat. But here we have 2 CDs with the repeat intact for what it's worth. There are 2 albums in this collection by a pianist who I never heard of before. Her name was Zola May Schaulis. And I did an episode fairly recently where I talked about 5 piano recordings on Deutsche Grammophon of Bach's Goldberg variations, because I thought that there only were 5 piano recordings of the Goldbergs on this label. Well, I was wrong, because there's actually a 6th that comes from 1971 and featured Zola May Schaulis. And it's a really nice recording. It doesn't have any of the repeats, but it's a really good, no frills, very honest, very direct, really attractive performance. And she also made a Bach recording a few years later containing some, but not all, of the Bach toccatas. And again, I had no idea this disc existed, and it's a marvelous release. Also in this collection is something that has been on CD before, Roberto Zidon's recording of the Ives Concord Sonata. And also, there was a disc with Eric ten Berg playing the Rager Telemann variations. It's not the most interesting piece, and the performance is okay. But what you really want this disc for is Paul Baumgartner's recording from the early 1950s of the Beethoven Diabelli variations. This is an absolutely first-class interpretation. And Australian Eloquence had reissued the Tenberg and Baumgartner performances on a single disc quite a few years ago, but it's good to have it in this collection. Now, for my next release of 2024 that I think is quite important, whether or not you respond to the epic length and impossibly thick piano works by Sorabji, you really have to hand it to those pianists who fervently believe in this repertoire and who spend hours on end mastering the music's impossibly elaborate intricacies. Probably the most familiar of these big Sorabji pieces is Opus Clavicembalisticum, and for years it was listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the world's longest non-repetitive piano piece. Of course, there are much longer non-repetitive piano pieces by Sorabji, but in any case, it's Opus Clavicembalisticum, or OC, as we like to call it, that probably is the best known of these. And it was the pianist Geoffrey Douglas Madge who gave the modern world premiere of OC in 1982. That performance came out on LP only. And then there was a later performance of his that came out on BIS on CD. But then there was John Ogden's studio recording on the Altaris label. However, there is a new studio recording by Don Vandewalle, and I think by far it is the most accurate and most meticulous and most thought-out interpretation in terms of pacing and dynamics and character, not to mention accuracy. And it's on the Pasakai label, and this is not music you're going to want to listen to every day, but this 5-disc set of Don Vandewalle playing Sorabji's Opus Clavicembalisticum is a standard-setting recording of a work that does have quite a lot of significance. The Marston label released a fascinating collection containing mostly unpublished live recordings featuring the pianist Robert Goldsand. Robert Goldsand was born in Vienna in 1911, and he died in New York in 1991. He studied with two Franz Liszt pupils, Moritz Rosenthal and Emil von Sauer. He launched his American career in 1927, and he was active as a soloist and as a teacher for decades. Although Robert Goldsand made a good number of commercial recordings in the 1950s for the concert hall label, they really do not show Goldsand at his best and at his most inspired. But a collection of live recital recordings that exist tell another story altogether. My dear friend Donald Manildi, who is the curator of the International Piano Archives at Maryland, did a wonderful job curating a 3-disc anthology for Marston, culled from Goldsand's concerts, that really does his artistry justice. There's a lot of wonderful material here. The Clementi F-sharp minor sonata, for instance, the 6 Liszt Paganini etudes, and there are some Chopin etude performances that are so much more inspired than those in his 1950s studio recordings. You can find this release, which is called Robert Goldsand, The Lost Recitals, exclusively from Marston Records, and I put a link in the podcast description for you to go to the Marston website and buy this release, and I really encourage you to do so. I think Marston Records deserves so much support. I mean, the thoroughness and the integrity that goes into all of their historic releases is just without peer. I also enjoyed a release from Challenge Records by Alessio Bax entitled Forgotten Dances, and it's a really well-curated recital of music inspired by dance in polished yet stylish and inspired performances. You get a vigorous Bach A minor English suite that I think gives Martha Argerich a run for her money. There's Bartok's Dance Suite, the Ritual Fire Dance by Defia, and there's a beautifully thought out and symphonically oriented reading of Maurice Ravel's La Valse. It's a performance I really love. It seems to begin from almost nothing, but it builds in long paragraphs with subtle yet indisputable forward momentum. And, so many pianists tend to pull La Valse about in all directions and draw attention to themselves and poke around with inner voices at random. But Alessio Bach's knows better, and this is a marvelous disc. Next, the second volume in a survey of piano music by the Chinese composer Gaegon Ru attracted me quite a lot. This second volume features Gaegon Ru's 12 etudes for extended piano, composed for and played by Yiming Zhang. These pieces explore a wide gamut of extended techniques, such as using the hands on the strings of the piano to strum and pluck in all kinds of different ways, placing objects on or in between the strings to create evocative percussive effects. In a way, this music expands on the kind of extended techniques explored in great depth by composers like Henry Cowell and John Cage and George Crumb. But what I find interesting about Gaegon Ru is that when he uses these extended techniques, they never seem to be ends in themselves. They have musical and emotional expression all the time, almost as if the sounds coming from the instrument absolutely have to be those specific sounds and no others. And of course, a disc like this needs the best possible engineering, and that we do get on this highly recommendable release on the Grand Piano label. Definitely check it out. I also want to mention a release on the Everbest label featuring the pianist Craig Rutenberg playing many, many, many portraits by Virgil Thomson. Virgil Thomson composed portraits from life, meaning that you would sit in a chair across from him and you could read, you could sleep, but you couldn't talk. And then Virgil Thomson would put his pencil to manuscript paper. He wouldn't use a piano, and he would just look at you in the chair and he would compose. Now, not all of his portraits necessarily resemble the portrait subjects, but it's a fascinating group of compositions. He wrote more than 150 portraits, most of them for piano, and Craig Rutenberg has not recorded them complete, but he recorded, I would say, maybe 3/4 of them. And he does wonderful, wonderful work. After all, Craig Rutenberg was a protege of Virgil Thomson, and he himself was a portrait subject. So this is definitely a release that adds to the catalog. It's a real contribution to the recorded discography. And finally, I'd like to recommend a release by the Swiss pianist François-Xavier Poisat. And he's come out with this 6-disc set in anticipation of the Ravel 150th birthday celebration that's happening in March. And this is a collection that contains every composition by Ravel that involves the piano, from solo works to the 2 concertos to chamber music and to songs. Actually, it's all the music that Ravel had published. There are a few unpublished pieces in there, but essentially it is the complete Ravel canon with piano. And everything is gorgeously engineered, and all of the performances are absolutely first-rate. Poisat is a pianist who essentially is a classicist. He doesn't go for momentary thrills or titillation. And the focus and the maturity that I find in his interpretations, I think, will really stand the test of time. And there's also a beautiful booklet with great annotations and artwork. This is a real collectible, I think, and I think it belongs in every serious Ravel collection. I gave this release a rave review in Gramophone, and I posted a link to my review in the episode description. I really think you should seriously consider getting this release. So, all of the recordings I've been talking about count among the year 2024's most memorable and recommendable releases and reissues. Of course, I could have included a lot more, and I know that you have particular favorites that I did not mention, and I would like to know what they are. I'd like to know what you think are the best releases and reissues from this year. Please let me know. Go to my Substack page and let's have a chat about that. This is Jed Disler for The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings, and I thank you for joining me this first season. And if you would consider subscribing to my Piano Maven Substack page, it would be of great help to our Piano Maven community as we begin our second season with a special daily or almost daily podcast mini-series covering recordings of the 32 Beethoven piano sonatas. So have a very happy new year, be well, stay safe, and show kindness to one another.